This is a review of The Art of X-Men: The Last Stand, from concept to feature film. So even though Disney's recent acquisition of Fox may be the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of the industry, as Disney moves towards a total monopoly on entertainment and media, the silver lining, however, is that now that X-Men has entered the fold, we may actually start to see some art books for X-Men films. Because in this last decade, every single DC and Marvel superhero movie has received an art and or making of book. The X-Men movies, however, including Deadpool, have received none. The only X-Men art books that have been released have been The Art of X2, which I have done a review on, and this book, The Art of X-Men: The Last Stand. But more important is that we might actually receive some good ones, because I wasn't very impressed with the X2 art book, and this art book for X-Men: The Last Stand is just trash, which, considering the movie it's based on and the publisher of this book, is perhaps not much of a surprise. And just to clarify that statement, when I say considering the movie it's based on, if you've seen The Last Stand, I'm sure you know what I mean. And the fact that it was published by Newmarket Press, during the sort of mid-2000s, Newmarket Press was the publisher that I mostly remember for being responsible for producing a lot of film-related tie-in books, and usually these were just photo books, just stills from the movie with little to no text, and they were awful. Thankfully, Newmarket was bought by HarperCollins and has seemed to have disappeared and doesn't make any of those books nowadays. So I think most of this review is going to be focused on what's wrong with the book, but I just want to make it clear that I really do think that just because something is objectively bad doesn't mean you shouldn't like it. The reason that I focus on a lot of the negatives is just because I want to make sure you have a realistic expectation in understanding if the book is something you'll enjoy. So first up, the book is very slender, actually deceptively so, because it's actually about 160 pages, which isn't great, but it's also not out of the ordinary, particularly for books of the time. However, it actually looks a lot thinner because the paper quality is really cheap. Like it's maybe just slightly above magazine quality. And I mean, you could say, hey, that makes it feel more like a comic book, but I actually think it's just because they're cheap. And so not only is the book quite short, they then waste a lot of the space with filling it up with stills from the movie. And then also the text is formatted really weird, with the blocks of the body text running diagonally. The idea behind this, I guess, is that each diagonal would sort of create the arm of an X shape, which sounds like an amusing novelty, but it's really just stupid, because they're like, hey, look, we've got half a page of text, but no, it's just a quarter page of text. You've just run it along the diagonal of half a page. So in the actual art section of this book, there is almost no text. There's captions, and then occasionally you'll get some sort of quote from one of the filmmakers. The majority of the text is actually in the first third of the book, which is really interesting and actually has nothing to do with the making of the movie or anything to do with the movie. It goes through each of the characters that appear in the movie, but is actually just focused on discussing their sort of history and development in the comics. And whether or not that will be interesting to you really depends on how familiar you are with the history of the X-Men comics themselves. But whether or not this stuff is interesting is beside the point. It is entirely inappropriate to include this sort of information, to take up a third of this book that should be focused on the movie. That space should have been, that text should have been focused on the actual movie, which, you know, is why you'd be buying this book, not for a history of the comics. Obviously, it would be fun to have, you know, bits of information on the comics and their development and the characters to compare how they translate to film. But to have this entire section just dedicated to the comics history and nothing to do with the movies when that's what you're buying the book for is just so misleading and out of place. And then the other 2/3 of the book is dedicated to the concept art. There's actually quite a nice variety in here. behind the scenes photography, like I said, lots of stills from the movie, but then also storyboards, character and location concept art, and then also a couple of pieces taken directly from the comics. The actual art direction is very similar to in the Art of X2 book, and that was my sort of personal main disappointment, which is something you see in pretty much the art direction for all superhero related movies, I feel, whether that's Avengers or Batman or X-Men, which is that the concept art never really conveys this sort of exciting or dynamic fantastical worlds. And I know concept art is not comic book art, but it's always seemed strange to me that designs that have been adapted from comics, which are such a visually exciting medium, end up looking very drab and industrial. Like in this book, it's a lot of stuff that we've seen in other sort of superhero related concept art books. You know, it's lots of sort of like industrial underground bases and like slightly futuristic weapons and things. Lots of very drab, dark grays and metals and concrete. And even though that's a direction that works really well on screen when you're trying to tell a semi-realistic superhero movie, but it doesn't necessarily make for the most interesting art book in my opinion. But despite the fact this is certainly one of the worst art books to be featured on this channel, I still think there is probably a subset of X-Men fans who may enjoy having it as part of their collection, if for no other reason than the fact that art books for the X-Men movies have been so rare.